the first part of chapter 9, Paul's been showing that those who taught the gospel had the right to be supported for that teaching. But while he says he had that right, he did not exercise it. He hadn't personally taken any support from the Corinthians. Instead, he had supported himself while he was there, and he took a little support from the Philippians as well. But he goes on in verse 19 to say, despite the fact that he was free from all men, that he had voluntarily made himself a slave to everyone in order that he might persuade some to obey the gospel. And he did that whether they were Jews or Gentiles. So in other words, what he says is that he respected the customs and the social practices of those that he was teaching. When he was with the Jews, he respected their customs and their cultural practices. But we see in verse 21, when he was with the Gentiles, he didn't try to enforce the law of Moses on them as a condition of salvation. Instead, he adapted his teaching to those who weren't under the law of Moses. And the best example that I can think of for that is when Paul was in Athens in Acts chapter 17. When he was there on the Areopagus, he didn't start with the law of Moses like he would have if he was teaching Jews. What he did was he started with God as the creator. And he went from there and tried to convince them that the God that he was preaching was the true God, not all these other gods that they were worshiping. But he says whoever that he was teaching, he never compromised the truth in any way. He always followed the law of Christ. And so he says in verse 22, he just continues that same thought. When he was around those who were spiritually weak, those who were immature Christians that we talked about in chapter 8, he was willing to give up his Christian freedoms, the things that he could do if it might influence them for wrong. And so he did that to try to get them to obey the gospel. And that was his primary motive for teaching, to help others come to Christ. But he says in verse 23 that he also did it so that he would be a fellow partaker of them in the gospel. That is, so that he could share with them in the blessings of the gospel, which is ultimately salvation. And so he's going to go on here in verses 24 down through 27, and he's going to give them an example. He gives them an example of athletic events to show them and to show us the need that we have for total commitment to our service to God. So we know that, we talked about this in the introduction, that the Isthmian Games were something that was held at Corinth. They were held about 8 miles from the city itself, and they were held about every 2 years. So this is something that the Corinthians were very familiar with. And so Paul is going to use this as an example to show them the effort and the focus that we need to have as Christians. And it needs to be the same intensity, if you will, that an athlete preparing for these games had. So he says that only one person is going to win the race. And so the idea is that is the approach that we should live our lives as Christians, that we have to give our complete and single-minded effort to serving God. Can't allow ourselves to be distracted by something else. And so he goes on in verse 25 and says, those who competed in these games had to exercise complete self-control in their preparation and their training. Again, that emphasizes, I think, the intensity and the focus, the self-control, if you will, the commitment that we should have as Christians. I think we often see that that athletes in the world today are much more dedicated to their cause than sometimes we are as Christians. And so I think this is a good example for us. But while those athletes are competing for what he calls a perishable crown, a crown that's going to fade very quickly and die, we are striving for an imperishable crown. We're striving for an eternal crown, for eternal life. And so we should be willing, like they were, to give up anything in our lives that would keep us from receiving that reward. And so then he goes on in verses 26 and 27, and he uses himself as an example. He says he himself practiced self-discipline. He says when he runs, he's focused on the finish line. He's headed directly for it. He doesn't go off on any tangents. He doesn't veer off in any way. He's headed directly for the goal, focused on it. He doesn't box with wild, uncontrolled blows like he's shadow boxing, but he's got carefully aimed punches. And so he says he disciplines his body and brings it under control so that he won't lose the race, so that he won't be disqualified from the race. And so basically he's saying so he won't lose his eternal reward after he's spent all this time, most of his life, serving Christ, so that he won't lose his reward. And so the point, I think, is, to me at least, here we have the Apostle Paul, and if the Apostle Paul says that he has to exercise self-control so that he won't lose his reward, what does that say about us? I think that tells us that we have to be very careful and that we have to do the same thing that he did. Okay, so that brings us to the end of chapter 9. So let's pause here for just a minute and see if anybody has any comments. Jim?
Thank you. So a couple of extra biblical things. We were blessed to go on a trip following the footsteps of Paul many years ago, taking our family. We went to Corinth. Maybe some others in here have done that as well. And we were actually able to stand over some starting blocks that were carved out of granite there in Corinth. So it's amazing to see when Paul talks about the race. Wow, look, there's some starting blocks right there for the race. Also, I think Paul was so practical, and I don't know how much of this was providential. We'll never know. But he says, to the weak I became weak. I have become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. So it's interesting. I think of Paul as somebody like with a PhD, right? He studied under Gamaliel, very educated, a lot of status. But what was he doing in Corinth? He was making tents, right? So he had to learn that skill. Probably wasn't an easy one. Probably was hot and dirty. He met, of course, Aquila and Priscilla there who did the same thing. But I feel like he's so strategically intelligent because every 2 years, as you mentioned, people from all over Asia Minor would come to those games. So what better place to have a gospel meeting ongoing every day than when they come to you, right? And so I've always been fascinated with that idea that he would humble himself, take what we might call a lower job, a physical job that was very difficult. But also I think of somebody, we all think about how when we're doing mindless work, which this probably was, he was probably good at it, and so he didn't have to think about it much. When we do mindless work, what do? We typically think about those things that we've got to do soon. And so I can see Paul working half the day, making tents, talking with his brethren there, and thinking about what am I going to speak about tonight? What do these people need, right? And so it's just interesting to me how that practically all kinds, possibly, I know I'm taking a lot of leeway here, but it seems like that might have been something that allowed him to really make an impression on the people that came to Corinth thinking they were going to run races, and he was talking about a different one.
Yeah, I think Paul always took advantage of whatever circumstances he was in, and That is certainly one. We talked about the fact at the beginning that people from all over the Roman Empire were coming through Corinth, and one of the things was the races that they came to. And so he took advantage of that. Scott?
I think verse 21, so many times people have a misunderstanding when Paul uses the word law, and so many times he's so specific when he's saying laws, are specifically referring to the law of Moses and a law-keeping system. But how many times have we heard people say, well, see, we're not under law, we're under grace, almost as if that's a license to do, particularly religiously, as we want to do, whereas Paul quickly has to throw in that, what's in parentheses in my book. Wait a minute, now I'm still under law to God. I'm under the law of Christ.
Right.
I'm talking about what he's talking about here is I became like a Jew or under the law of Moses to those that were Jewish, that I might try to convert them and win them, and so forth. So we are under law. We still have restraints that we have to respect. We just can't say, well, I'm under grace and therefore I get to. Yeah. It's my choice.
Yeah, and I think he's going to go ahead and talk about that a little bit more here in just a minute. But man has always been under law, right? God's law. And so I do think he emphasizes that here, that while I did this, I never compromised God's law, the law of Christ. Good point. Anything else? Okay, let's move on to chapter 10 then. So Paul has just explained how he personally had to guard against falling away. And so in this chapter, he's going to address the idea that some of the Corinthians seemed to have that because they had become Christians, they were so strong now that they couldn't be lost, that they couldn't fall away. That's the idea that obviously the Jews had, wasn't it? I mean, they said, we're the children of Abraham, and so they thought because they were the children of Abraham, they were automatically saved. But I think it's something that we see sometimes amongst ourselves when we say, well, I've been baptized into Christ, I'm in the church of Christ, and so sometimes I think we get a little complacent as well and think just because we're members of the church that we're going to be saved as well. And so I think that's something that's obviously an application for us. Excuse me. So what he does is in verses 1 through 5, he's going to use Israel when they wandered in the wilderness to show that all of us can potentially fall away. And his argument is if the Israelites, who were God's chosen people and who had received all his blessings, could be lost because of their rejection, because of their disobedience to his will, the same can happen to any of us as Christians. And so what he's going to do is he's going to make several comparisons between the Israelite situation and what the Corinthians found themselves in, the circumstances that they found themselves in. And so he starts there in verse 1, and he talks about the fact that the Israelites had been baptized as they passed through the Red Sea. So this is obviously a metaphorical statement. They were completely enclosed when they went through the Red Sea by the pillar of cloud that was leading them, and by the sea which had been parted and was on both of their sides. Thayer says that word for baptized means overwhelmed. And so they were completely surrounded, if you will, by water at that time. So as a result of that baptism, they became disciples of Moses, and they followed after him. The Corinthians, who had become Christians, had been baptized into Christ, and so they were his disciples. And so there's one comparison. In verses 3 and 4, he goes on and talks about the spiritual food and drink that they were given. If you remember in Exodus chapter 16, that they had grumbled about the food that they were receiving, the food that they had, and they were talking about what they had left the food that they had left behind in Egypt. And so God provided them with manna, and then He provided them with quail a little bit later. So that was spiritual food in a sense to them because it was miraculously supplied to them. As far as the Corinthians, and let's go in John chapter 6 and verse 35. Jesus says, and that should be 31 through 35, not 31 through 25. Jesus says, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall not thirst." So Jesus is our spiritual bread. He is our food. Sorry, this is a little distracting for me. I don't know if it's a little distracting for you, but we'll try to get through it. Just when I think it's going to stop, it starts back up. Okay. So he's going to continue then. He says there were two instances when the people complained about the lack of water they had in Exodus 17 and also in Numbers 20. And so God then provided them with water. And so Paul says in verse 4 that they drank from a spiritual rock, which was Jesus Christ. And so he shows us two things by saying that. First thing he says is that shows us the pre-existence of Christ, that he existed before his physical birth. And also it indicates that Jesus was watching over Israel and sustaining them while they were in the wilderness. And the indication is that he was doing that with the Corinthians, and he does that with us today as well. But what we see in verse 5 is that although they had received all these blessings from God, and that God was very patient with them, as we know, that because of their unbelief and because of their rebellion, that, to say the least, God was not pleased with the majority of them. And so most of them died in the wilderness, all of them but two. And so, again, the point is that if they could fall away with all these blessings, being God's people, then the Corinthians and all of us who also have God's blessings can fall away as well. And so in verse 7, he's going to continue some of this comparison. He says basically starting in verse 7 that the Israelites served as an example. They served as a warning to them and to us not to make the same mistakes that they did, not to have the same attitude of disobedience and rebellion that they had. Because if we do that, we're going to be lost just like they were. And so in 7, he talks about the fact that the Israelites committed, the sins that the Israelites committed were in many ways the same kind of sins and temptations that the Corinthians were faced with. And so starting in verse 7, he lists those. The first one he lists is idolatry. The main example that we have of that is in Exodus chapter 32 and verse 6. And that, if you remember, is when Israel had worshipped the golden calf. And most of the translations say there that they sat down to eat and rose up to play. A couple of the newer translations, the NIV and the New Living Translation, translate that as they indulged in pagan revelry. In other words, they worshipped this idol. And so, as we've seen in Corinth, it was full of pagan idols. And so that was a normal practice for the inhabitants of that city, and that included those who had become Christians. And so then he goes on in verse 8 to talk about sexual immorality. The Israelites had committed sexual immorality with the women of Moab in Numbers 25. And the result of that was that 23,000 of them had died. Of course, again, the Corinthians were in an environment where they were surrounded by sexual immorality. They were constantly being tempted to return to that lifestyle that many of them had come out of. And it was also a part of the worship of the pagan idols that were in that town. So again, it was something that they were completely surrounded by. Then in verse 9, he talks about the fact that they tempted or put Christ to the test. And in Numbers 21 in verse 5, again what we see is that when the Israelites had become dissatisfied with their circumstances, they spoke against God and they spoke against Moses. And so this is the instance where God sends the fiery serpents among them. And so as a result of that, many of them died. It seems like in the context that some of the Corinthians were testing or provoking God to jealousy because they were continuing to participate in these feasts to idols. He's going to talk about that a little bit more down in verse 22. And again, I think this is something that we can do the same thing by trying to practice things that are maybe not in accord with God's will, or maybe by trying to get as close to sin as we can without sinning. I don't really think that's possible, but I think a lot of people try to do that. And so then, finally in verse 10, he says that they grumbled or they murmured against Moses' leadership. And that refers to Korah's rebellion, which is recorded in Numbers 14 and also in Numbers 16. And so when they did that, what they really were doing, they weren't really complaining against Moses. They were complaining against God. And so because of that, the 250 who were leaders of that rebellion were killed, along with over 14,000 others. Apparently the Corinthians were grumbling about their perceived limitations, if you will, that they had limitations on their freedom, such as eating meat in some circumstances. So again, I think we can do the same thing by complaining or refusing to obey God's commandments when we don't agree with them. So the Corinthians faced a lot of the same issues and a lot of the same temptations that the Israelites did. And that's the comparison that Paul is trying to make. And so those are issues that we can face as well today. So let me pause there again and see if there's any comments that anyone has that you'd like to make on the first 10 verses of chapter 10. Okay, we will move on. Okay, starting in verse 11, he says that these examples were provided for us so that we can benefit from Israel's mistakes, so that we won't go down the same path that they did. But Paul is indicating here that that's exactly the danger that the Corinthians were in. That's exactly the danger that they were possibly doing. And so this is a wake-up call, I think, for them, because God hasn't changed. God is going to deal with them. He's going to deal with us in the same way if we are disobedient. And so in verse 12, he goes on to say, if anyone thinks that he's saved, if anyone thinks that he's safe, thinks that he's so strong that he can't be vulnerable to temptation, then that's when he should be especially careful, very careful, because that's when we're most in danger. When we begin to think that we can't be lost, when we let our guard down, that's when we're most likely going to be tempted. And so we can't allow ourselves to become arrogant. We can't allow ourselves to become overconfident, thinking that we can't fall. Because we see even all these examples that we've seen, that even those who enjoy God's greatest blessings are not immune to temptation. So he talked about this, and now in the next couple of verses, he's going to give us three things, it seems, that will give us a little bit of encouragement and a little bit of strength when we face temptations. First of all, he says that we will never face a temptation that is unique to us. Everything that we face, somebody else has already faced. And so we're not alone in that. And so what we can do is we can learn from the experience of others who have faced these same temptations, and we can seek their help. We can seek their advice to overcome those temptations. Secondly of all, he gives us a guarantee that we're never going to be tempted above our ability to resist. Satan is not so strong that he can overcome us. If we depend on God, he's always going to be there for us. He's always going to give us the ability to resist. And then third, he says, he will always provide us with a way to escape or to overcome temptation. It's always going to be there. I think, we're going to have to look for that way of escape. We're not always going to be, it's not always going to hit us between the eyes like a 2x4. We're going to have to look for it sometimes. And so it's going to be there. God's going to do his part, but we also have to do our part. And the other thing is we have to want to find that way of escape. Sometimes I think we're tempted and we don't want to find that way of escape. And so we ignore it when God provides it to us. But there are no impossible situations as far as temptations go. As long as we rely on God and rely on his strength, we can overcome those things. So what he does in verse 14 is he tells them to run away or to flee from idolatry. So in this specific case, I think what he's talking about is the participation of some of them in a feast to an idol at its temple, which was equal to having fellowship with it, which we'll see here in just a few verses. But that principle obviously applies to us. That principle applies to everything that we do today. Anything can become our idol today. Anything that we make more important to us today can be our idol. And so we have to flee those things just like they had to flee the specific area of idolatry. Okay, so in verse 15, he basically appeals to their common sense and to their reason. He says that they could decide for themselves whether or not that what he was saying was the truth. And so he talks about two feasts to illustrate this point. First of all, he says, when we as Christians partake of the cup of blessing or the Lord's Supper, we have communion with Christ. We have communion with the blood and the body of Christ, and we have fellowship with all others who partake of that. And so we share in the benefit of his sacrifice. Secondly, he says, the same thing is true of the people of Israel in verse 18. They were in fellowship with God, and they were in fellowship with each other when they shared in the sacrifices offered at the altar. And so, if they understood these two examples, he says in verse 19 and 20, the same thing is true of those who participate in pagan feasts. Now, they probably understood that these idols weren't real, but what Paul says is when you participate in these feasts, even though you may not realize it, even though that may not be what you intend to do, you are in fact worshiping this idol, and you are sharing in fellowship with it and with the demons that the idol represents. And so the logical conclusion, he says in verse 21 and 22, is how can you do that? Knowing what this idol represents, how do you think you can be in communion with Christ and also at the same time participate in idol worship? He says you can't. You can't be in fellowship with Christ, and you can't be in fellowship with the devil at the same time. And so in verse 22, he asks, were they intentionally in trying to make God jealous by their unfaithfulness? That's basically what the Israelites were doing, wasn't it? They made God jealous by their unfaithfulness in the wilderness. And so we know how that ended for them. And so obviously this is a example and a lesson for the Corinthians and also for us not to go again down that same path. Okay. Let me pause once again to see if there's any comments on verses 15 through 22.
I think this is such a rich section. He's talked about in chapter 8 that knowledge puffs up, and that there's a way we can be right in what we're thinking and knowing, but be wrong in how we behave because we become proud. And you see that in this section, the first part of chapter 10, talking about the Israelites who probably had confidence in God because God had brought them through so many things out of Egypt, and yet they weren't right, and God was not pleased with most of them. But then there's another, he turns the tables again, because we read those stories and we say, boy, those guys really had it wrong, and we kind of condescend to them. Yeah. And he says, you be careful, because these things are written for your admonition, and you can be guilty just like they were. He even says guilty of the specific sins. So you take heed lest you fall. I think that warning comes down to us, because we have the Bible as it is, full of these cautionary tales, that it's very easy for us to condescend to these people. And we laugh at Samson, and, how could Abraham not have enough faith to trust God would give him a child? And, all these things that we kind of look at and say, not honestly, really, what would I do in that situation? But instead, boy, they sure messed up. And in doing so, we end up falling into the same sins. I think there is a tremendous warning here that you can't reason about spiritual things pridefully. Even when you come to the right conclusions, you're still wrong, and you'll probably end up living wrong. So here's a situation with the meat sacrificed to idols. There's a right way. It would be okay technically. Paul never makes a rule about it, but he's saying, think about what you're doing. Think about what you're communicating. Think about how you affect other people. There's a lot more to it. So it seems to me there's a lesson there about our attitude and heart as we approach reasoning through these things, that even if we get the right answers, we can have it wrong if our hearts are still, full of pride and thinking we know best.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that maybe we even more are prone to do that than the Israelites were, because we have God's complete revealed word, and so we can look back on those things and think, like you said, wow, how could they possibly think that? But we're very prone to that as well. Rachel?
I just think in my past, I've looked at idolatry and I'm like, oh, we don't worship idols anymore. We're good. Like, that really doesn't pertain to us. And I just love Colossians 3, verse 5, and it says, put to death what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. And so, just like you said, like this was pertaining, the Corinthians were there was idolatry in Corinth. But when you think about the different pagan gods and idols, they represented those things, sexual immorality and covetousness and evil. And so when I put anything above God, like, I am practicing idolatry, and I need to be very careful of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the danger. We don't realize it a lot. It's not that physical thing that like they had, but it's just as serious. I'm going to go over here to Dick first, and then I'll come back.
Paul's writings and so much of the New Testament especially has us looking through a microscope at the threads of the tapestry, and we see this concern and this concern and this concern, all valid for us to be concerned about. I think it's really helpful from time to time to dial the microscope back up and see what the big picture is. Remember that Joseph, when he had his encounter with Potiphar's wife, had to ultimately say back to her, how could I do this great sin, this thing, and sin against my God? If I can step out the door each day and keep my focus tightly enough that I want to be sure my actions and my thoughts are going in God's direction and not my desires, I'll be taking care of the things that we're talking about here. When I see the big picture and don't keep myself so focused on some little something that keeps me from recognizing the thing next to me that's just as dangerous.
Yeah, if we're, like we say, if we're focused like that athlete on serving God, if we're completely focused on it, then those small things are not going to get in the way, I don't think. Yes.
I was reminded, as I studied through Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers recently, that the Israelites are not so different from us, that we can be grumblers and complainers, and it's easy to do that and fall into unbelief. And, so many of them wanted to be leaders like Moses or Aaron, and there's so many human qualities that I think we all have to be careful of. And I think, when it says he provides us a way of escape, it made me think, I think it's in 1 John, that he who is in us is greater than he who is in the world. That, we now, under the new covenant, have more than they had under the old covenant. Even though God was with them, in the wilderness, now God is in us. But I think here is also a warning of the temptations that when we get too close to the things of the world, that we can fall into temptation. So there's that balance between we want to influence the world, but we don't want to become like the world. So we always have to be careful there and be careful that we're not taken captive by hollow and deceptive philosophies, which all of these things can be kind of nuanced, but we have to, be on our guard, for the enemy roars like a lion, looking for whom he may devour. So
You're right. He's always alert to when we're weak. So we have to be constantly strong.
Hey, sorry, I didn't want Mike to walk all the way back, so I was trying to catch him. I think something like I think about this passage that, like, when I think Jacob has kind of already touched on this, but for me, and I think about this as like approving things. It's what it feels like they were doing with these idols. Is they were like, maybe he offers like that. Hey, this eating part of it is actually part of they consider it as part of their worship service.
Right.
So when you eat of it, they kind of view you as you're worshiping with them.
Right.
So, like, I look at this in the same way. It's like, well, does that mean that, like, I can't go buy coffee from Starbucks because they support all these things that I don't agree with, abortion and, you know, like a lot of things that don't line up with God's law. So it's like you could take that to the extreme and just never buy any clothing, make your own clothing, and do all this. Obviously, I'm not saying that's where we go. I'm just saying, I think when I look at this, back to kind of what Jacob was, I think, already said, and it's like making sure that reevaluating yourself and the decisions that you're making, that you're not impacting others so that maybe weaker brother feels tempted to do something or you feel tempted to do something. It's just being careful about your decision making and thinking about it maybe before you just do it.
Yeah, he's going to talk about that, in fact, in the coming verses, but I don't know that this is an exact correlation, but we're told to render to Caesar the things of Caesar and to God the things that are of God. Caesar was doing all sorts of evil things, and yet God says that we're supposed to, pay taxes to him. So, I think maybe that's an example of that. But yeah, he is definitely going to talk about the fact in the coming verses that we have to be very careful about our influence and the things that we do, because we can definitely cause our brother. In fact, in verse 23, that's what he's going to talk about. He's going to talk about the fact that there are some things that we know are right, that are morally indifferent, but if our brother doesn't know that and we influence them, then we're causing them to sin. So again, when we do things, we have to be very careful about us asserting our rights about things that are morally indifferent. Consider how that's going to affect our brother. And so instead of promoting our own interest, we should only do what edifies and serves our brother. He's going to go ahead and talk about some specific situations there with the eating of this meat sacrificed to idols. Cole sort of touched on all that already, and so we're going to sort of skip down to the end so we can get down through this. Basically, I want to look at 31 through 33 just to close. And what he says is, basically, we always have to act in a way that's going to bring glory to God and not cause someone else to sin. So occasionally we may have to give up our rights to do that. So I think the point is, in whatever we do in life, we always have to ask, is this going to bring glory to God? Or are we going to cause someone to possibly sin? We're told in 2 Thessalonians 2 to avoid even the appearance of evil. And so that's a principle that I think we can apply to everything we do in our lives. We don't want to do things that will cause a brother to sin. We don't want to get as close to sin as we can, because that's not bringing glory to God. And so Paul says that he's willing to give up his rights in order to save others. And their salvation was much more important to him than his personal liberties. And so he's going to conclude this in verse 1 of chapter 11 by saying they should follow his example as he followed Christ. In this case, that would be willing to sacrifice their rights for the good of others. Okay, we're out of time, so thank you very much. Next week we will tackle chapter 11.